Hello viewers, welcome to week 4, lecture 4 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University. This lecture is in continuation with the concepts of Russian formalism that we are discussing, and in this lecture I am going to talk about Mikhail Bakhtin and his achievements. Bakhtin is very important figure in the history of literary theory for particularly giving a new dimension to literary criticism in terms of analysis of fiction and the language of fiction. Bakhtin is also significant because in Bakhtin we find a fruitful marriage of formalism and non-formalistic approach. For example, we can say Marxism and formalism, they are best blended in the works of Mikhail Bakhtin. So Bakhtin was writing, as we can see, primarily in the 20th century, and his original writings were done in the 1920s and 30s. In fact, it was a time when this movement called formalism, it was dissipating, and the fact is that Bakhtin remained in the background for quite a longer time, as was the fate of most of the Russian formalists, and an interest was aroused in Bakhtin in the 1980s when his works were translated, right? So he represents the later phase of formalism, that is what we can say. And often we find that there is a controversy, there are clouds of ambiguity around the authorship, right? So many times it is believed that Mikhail Bakhtin wrote with some other names such as Pavel Medvedev or Valentin Voloshinov. So, these confusions are always there. However, we find that, Bakhtin and his acolytes, they focus on linguistic structure of literary works. And like formalists, however, they believe that language is inseparable from ideology. They debunk the Marxist assumption that ideology is purely a mental phenomena or it is a product of material socio-economic substructure. They believe that language is related to ideology, but at this cost, formalistic considerations cannot be subordinated or subjugated in literary discussions. For example, Voloshinov says at one point, consciousness itself can arise and become a viable fact only in the material embodiment of science. Language is a socially constructed science system. It is a material reality. So here we find that how Bakhtin and Voloshinov, they differ from formalists in the sense that for the formalist, language is not related to the material reality outside. Language is always seen in terms of its intrinsic features, and they totally ignore the extrinsic dimensions of language. However, these Bakhtinians believe that language is related to material reality. These thinkers are not interested in language as a system of abstract science. For them, language is a discourse, it is a social phenomena. So language cannot be dissociated, or its ties cannot be severed from the sociological dimensions, right? These critics believe that words are active and dynamic social signs, right? And they take on different meanings, different connotations in different social settings and historical situations. So in this way, this is remarkable in Bakhtin and his acolytes, that how they take into consideration not only the formal aspects of language, but also sociological and historical dimensions of language, right? So for, we can say that if we look at their views on language, we can find that they're suggesting an alternative formalism, right? However, we find that there is a kind of balance in their approach. For example, if we look at the work of Trotsky's Literature and uh, Revolution, which is again a very significant work which came out in 1924, there we find that Trotsky has launched a vitriolic attack on formalism, right? And later on, we can say that Trotsky's views were very instrumental in deciding the course of this Marxist criticism, in which, language or literature was seen as something totally subservient to ideology. So that kind of imbalance is not there in these Bakhtinians, right? For example, Bakhtin believes that a person's speech is made of diverse social context, right? So he says that it does not express a ready-made autonomous individuality, right? So language is not the property of an individual. An utterance is not a property of an individual that can be understood only at a given time, right? So it can only be understood in various contexts, right? So whenever a language or an utterance comes into existence, it is always in dialogue with other kind of language systems, right? So it says that an utterance in speech or literature owes its inflection to various factors. So they primarily enumerate three factors. First is social situation. Then an utterance or an individual's speech cannot be dissociated from its social situation. Whenever we utter something, it cannot be that it is purely generation of an individual's eccentric thinking and he is saying something. Any utterance can be understood only in context of a situation in which it has been made. What is the social reality around that goes into making that utterance? The other consideration is the addressee, to whom you are making that utterance, to whom you are making that statement. So it is always going to affect us. For example, if I have to convey some quotes, so it matters whether I am conveying it to a 5-year-old child or whether I am conveying it to an 80-year-old man. So in this way, what will be the nature of my utterance? It will be decided by the presence of that addressee. Not only that, there is a third relationship, that any utterance cannot be considered to be absolutely autonomous. It is always contingent on the prior utterances which have been made in a similar situation, and in this way. So all these things are there. Discourse in the novel is a very important work by Bakhtin, right? There he is talking about novel as a discourse, right, where language is seen with all its potentiality and multivalence, right, or multiplicity. So in a novel, Bakhtin says multiplicity of divergent and contending voices are present. And in this way, he says that there is a dialogic interaction with those voices and narrator's voice. So in a way, we find that how he comes closer to the concept of polyphony or heteroglossia. We'll be discussing these concepts later on, right? So, for example, Bakhtin in this way is quite un-Aristotelian, because if we look at Aristotle's enumeration of various elements of literature, it goes like action, character, thought, diction, spectacle, and music. There we find that how Aristotle places language at the fourth point. But for Bakhtin, discourse is primary, language is primary, right? So all voices and social attitudes which are opposed to each other, they can be found in language. And he says that they are irreconcilable. Even in that way, he is different from Aristotle or disciples of Aristotle. As in the previous lecture, we have also seen that how in Russian formalism, while we were discussing the concepts of this defamiliarization, especially in context of Tristram Shandy, that how disorder is preferred over order, because disorder is something that makes things strange. Similarly, we find that Bakhtin is saying that language, is of utmost importance, and in the language of a novel, what we find that how different voices are contending with each other. Many times they are sharply opposed to each other. They are in contrast with each other, and there is no reconciliation among all those voices. So he says that in this way, a novel, in terms of its language, if we look at it as a discourse, it remains open-ended, and where various contradictions, oppositions remain unresolved, right? So in this way, we will find that how Bakhtin is talking about literary works and how these works function on micro-linguistic levels, by intersecting a wide variety of competing utterances and speech acts, right? Bakhtin is very well known for his concept of heteroglossia that he popularized, right? Heteroglossia means coexistence of different linguistic varieties or styles of discourse. If we look at the origin or etymology of this word, it comes from the Greek root hetero, which means different, and glossa, which means tongue or language. So in a way, heteroglossia is a coexistence of different kinds of languages, right, or different dimensions of language, right? And in Russian, it is known as varied speechedness, where a variety of speeches are there. Heteroglossia involves specific points of view of the world, forms for conceptualizing the world in words, specific worldviews, each characterized by its own objects, meanings, and values. So in this way, we can see that heteroglossia becomes the base condition governing the operation of meaning in any utterance, and that which always guarantees the primacy of context over text. So here we find that on the one hand, they are not ignorant of the formal dimension of language. They always look at a text as a literary structure, and they are talking about the richness of language with all its multiplicity, a similar condition as we have seen with the new critics or Russian formalists. But at the same time, they are saying that the context is primary. The context is very significant in language. So in this way, Bakhtin goes on to say that if we look at the nature of language, fundamentally it tries to suppress the heteroglot nature of language itself. And he says that especially if we look at our ordinary speech, if we look at our day-to-day utterances, if we look at the language as it is lively used by people in their conversation, the nature of language comes out to be as a heteroglot in nature. However, when we look at linguistic constructs, when we are conscious of ordering of those things, we find that there is a tendency to suppress this heteroglot nature of language. And in this way, he says that the function of a literary artist or a novelist is to realize this heteroglot nature of language, and that becomes a special feature of the novelistic discourse. That is what he is arguing. While discussing this concept, Bakhtin is also using two concepts. He says that if you look at language, there are two kinds of forces which can be seen. One is the centripetal force and the other is centrifugal force. If we look at a centripetal force means there is a convergence of all forces to a given point. There is an overlapping of all forces on a given point. That is called centripetal, where the center has a kind of gravity in which it draws all the forces towards itself. So what we can say, convergence of all forces. For example, if you look at a lens and how a lens causes conversion of sun rays to a focal point. So that is called centripetal force. And he says that what is centripetal force in language? He says that, as we have already talked about, language in its reality, in its spontaneity, in its natural existence is always a heteroglot. It is always heteroglossic. It means that in language there are centrifugal forces, there are opposing forces, there is a disorder, there is a chaos, there is an anarchy, right? And that is called centrifugal, how all forces are going away from any kind of imagined center or which tries to converge the forces of those things, right? So he says that in language there is a conflict between centrifugal forces or dimension and centripetal forces. Right. So in a way, what is centripetal? Centripetal is a kind of attitude towards language in which we try to resolve these contradictions, these oppositions. For example, if we talk about grammar, various rules are there to organize language. So in this way, we'll find that how in grammar there is an attempt to organize the otherwise disordered language, right? For example, if we look at linguistics, if we look at dictionary, how dictionary tries to freeze terms, freeze meanings of words. There is an attempt at standardization of language. That, words, if we look at the words originally, they have multiple meanings. Like when we were talking about Russian formalists, particularly Shklovsky, and later on in a lecture we'll be talking about Shklovsky and Derrida and what they say about metaphor. Shklovsky says that words in their origin are always concrete. They are not ideas, they are images. But with the passage of time, this concreteness has given place to abstractions. So in a way, in dictionary, what you find, various rules are there where we try to freeze the meaning of words. That takes us towards standardization of language, stabilization of language, stabilization of this variety of meaning. So these are called centripetal forces. And in this way, Bakhtin is idealizing the centrifugal nature of discourse or centrifugal nature of language. So in this way, heteroglossia was very important concept given by Bakhtin. Further, Voloshinov, he is very critical of those linguists or those thinkers who always treat language as a dead entity. For Voloshinov and Bakhtinians, language is a live phenomenon. It is constantly growing, it is constantly thriving, and it is not neutral, it is not static, it is not dead. And in this way, they are very critical of thinkers or linguists who explore language as an object of investigation, as if language, were a dead phenomena. For example, he decried the isolated, finished, monologic utterance divorced from its verbal and actual context and standing up not to any possible sort of active response, but to passive understanding, right? Bakhtin makes another important point about language, very interesting point about language. He says that if you look at verbal signs, so even for them language is a system of signs, and if we look at those verbal signs, he says that these verbal signs, they are always operating in the arena of class struggle, continuous class struggle, right? And what they are, he is saying that, you know, the ruling class always tries to make language narrow and uni-accentual. Why? Because they have to impose a kind of authority. Largely, they are concerned with commands which are to be given to people, right? So, in this way, he says that when there comes a situation of social unrest, there we realize the potential of these verbal signs. There we realize that they are not uni-accentual, but they are multi-accentual. They are multivalent in that way. And in this way, he is trying to establish a correlation between the class interests and how they clash and intersect upon the ground of language, right? So, in situation of a revolution, language realizes its full potential because it disrupts or it disobeys any kind of authority that has been imposed on it to channelize meaning through a narrow passage by the ruling class or by the dominant class, you know. This notion of dominant ruling class we'll find everywhere. Even we found that how the formalists were talking, I mean the pure formalists were talking about this dominant in language, that how it changes over a period of time. So, in this way we find that how Bakhtin looks at language as something that is dynamic, and he gives a dynamic view of language. You know, literary structure and literary traditions, they are not static, they are not frozen, rather they are dynamic, right. So, he goes on to say that despite saying that nature of language, how it is related to class interest, he says that literature is not a direct reflection of social forces. He says that class interest, rather how it disrupts authority and liberates alternative voices. In that way, they look at class interest, not that, you know, class interests are directly reflected in language. So, in this way, we find that how Bakhtin proposes a libertarian view of language, in which writer, you know, realizes this freest play of different value systems. There is no imposition of authority or on alternatives. So, in this way we find that how Bakhtin is profoundly un-Stalinistic. Un-Stalinistic in the sense that, you know, he is saying something which was completely opposed to the Soviet version of criticism. Bakhtin makes a distinction between the novels of Tolstoy and novels of Dostoevsky. He says that in the novels of Tolstoy, though multiple voices are there, even then you find that this authorial voice, it always tries to impose its supremacy over the other voices. It tries to subjugate the other voices, right? But in Dostoevsky's novels, there is no attempt to orchestrate that unity, right, of various points of view. And in this way, he says that Dostoevsky's novels are polyphonic in nature, while Tolstoy's novels are monologic in nature. And there we find that how, you know, Bakhtin comes to his concept of dialogism, what is called his, what he calls a dialogic discourse, in which multiple voices are there and there is no attempt at any repression, or there is no attempt to achieve a kind of unity out of those distinct voices, right. So, he says that though a text can't be monologic, narrators report on utterance of other characters inescapably is double voicedness. So, characters' consciousness independent from the author, not subordinated. It retains its integrity in a polyphonic novel, right. So, there we find that characters are not only objects of author words, but subjects of their own directly significant word as well. In his another famous work, Rabelais, in his work, you know, he explores the liberating and often subversive use of dialogic forms in classical, medieval and Renaissance culture. And here in that concept, in that context, he develops his concept of the carnivalesque, right? For example, this carnivalesque or carnivalizing tendency of language was very evident during the time of the Renaissance. By carnivalesque, Bakhtin means it is a time of festivities or carnival in which collective and popular things could be seen. You know, in a mela or in a jamboree or in that kind of gathering, he says that how hierarchies are turned upside down. You know, how fools become wise, how kings become beggars, right? So in this way, he says that in a carnival, you know, authority is disrupted. And this force of language, you know, could be felt in a novelistic discourse. How in a carnival, two opposite things are mingled, how fact and fantasy they coexist, how heaven and hell coexist. You know, so in this way, the sacred is profaned. So this jolly relativity is proclaimed in a carnival, and their authoritative, rigid, and serious id is subverted, loosed, and mocked. So in this way, we find that how his concept of carnivalization was very important. And it is a popular and libertarian social phenomena, and it was very dominant during the time of the Renaissance, right? He gives another example of carnivalization. There he says that how carnival shapes genres. For example, he says that if you look at Socratic dialogues, you know, in their original form, Socratic dialogues were carnivalistic. Their discovery of truth was based on exchange of views. It was not an authoritative monologue. But when we look at the works of Socrates, that it comes to us through Plato, we find that you know, carnivalesque nature of Socrates is diluted, right? So you know, we look at Socrates through sophisticated writings of Plato. So he says that some of the jolly relativity of carnival survives in the written works, some dilution of the collective quality of inquiry in which points of view collide without hierarchy, established by the author's voice, right? So he says that in the last dialogues of Plato, Socrates emerges as a sophisticated teacher. Carnivalistic image of Socrates is corroded in these works. You know, in these works, Socrates is not now the grotesque, henpecked provoker of argument, who was a midwife rather than author of truth. Further, you know, he says that if we look at Menippean satire, you know, where he says that how heaven, the underworld, and the earth, they have been represented. So, you know, there also we find this example of carnival. Further, he says that in Dostoevsky's story Bobok, it is a purely Menippean satire in the sense that it is about asymmetry in which people are dead, and now these dead people are talking from their graves. In this way, it represents a life outside the grave. And you know, before they lose their earthly consciousness, they get a few months from obligations of normal existence. And there, you know, we find a kind of revelation. For example, there is a character, Baron Klinevik. He is the king of corpses. He says this, I just want everyone to tell the truth. On the earth, it is impossible to live without lying because life and lie are synonymous. But here we will tell the truth just for fun. So here we find that how, you know, that at that subliminal level, there we find that how, you know, language is freed from all its constraints. And that is what he calls carnival. So in this way, polyphony, or how voices, you know, subversively, you know, act without authorial intervention, right? So in this way, individual identity is problematic. Bakhtin says that character is always elusive, insubstantial, and quirky. In this way, he is hinting in direction of psychological criticism. You know, though he does not question the author as Barthes do, but he resembles in privileging of the polyphonic novel. How Bakhtin, very much like Barthes, prefers liberty and pleasure to authority and decorum. For example, in Discourse in the novel, Bakhtin argues that form and content in discourse are one. Once we understand that verbal discourse is a social phenomena, social throughout its entire range, and in each and every of its factors, from the sound image to the furthest reaches of abstract meanings. So in this way, we find that how, Bakhtin evolved his concept of a polyphonic novel, dialogic novel, or heteroglossia, or carnival, and how these ideas were going to have a huge impact on the theories of post-structuralism, or deconstruction, where you find that we are always talking about the irreconcilability of the opposites, right? So this openness of text, instability of the structure of text, they are very peculiar to post-structuralist arguments, and in this way he is questioning the role of author. That role, author is not a dominant authority to order things, to channelize things, right? So in this way we come to the conclusion of this lecture with a quote from Don Bialotsky. He says that as a self-conscious practice, dialogic criticism turns its inescapable involvement with some other voices into a program of articulating itself with all the other voices of the discipline, the culture, all the world of cultures to which it makes itself responsible. Neither a live and let live relativism, nor a settled it once and for all authoritarianism, but a strenuous and open-ended dialogism would keep them talking to themselves and to one another, discovering their affinities without resting in them, and clarifying their differences without resolving them. So with this, I come to the end of the slide. Thank you.